I want to open with one number because it explains more about pensioner tax right now than almost anything else. £22. That's the entire gap left between the full new state pension and the personal allowance, the point where income tax kicks in. The state pension has climbed so close to that line that it's practically resting on it. And that matters far more than most people realize, because once your state pension alone eats up nearly your whole tax-free allowance, everything else you receive, a private pension, part-time earnings, even plain old interest on your savings, has nowhere left to hide. It becomes taxable from the very first pound. Nobody sends you a letter to warn you about this. HMRC won't. Your bank won't either, so let's walk through it properly. And I'll end with one allowance that a huge number of you watching could be using right now and simply aren't. This whole area tends to stay invisible until a bill lands, and by then the tax year it relates to has already closed. So first, let's separate two things that get mixed up constantly: the personal allowance and the personal savings allowance. Similar names, completely different jobs, and this mix-up trips up more people than anything else in this topic. Plenty of people assume that because their total income sits under the £12,570 personal allowance, their savings interest is automatically untouched. That's not necessarily true. The personal savings allowance stands entirely apart. It lets a basic rate taxpayer earn £1,000 of interest a year tax-free. For a higher rate taxpayer, that drops to just £500. And here's the part worth noting. That figure hasn't moved since it was introduced back in 2016, while savings rates have climbed a long way since then. Let's put real numbers against it. At today's typical savings rates, call it around 4.5%, someone with £22,000 tucked away is already close to the ceiling of that £1,000 allowance. Push that to £50,000 in savings and you're generating roughly £2,250 in interest a year. The first £1,000 is sheltered. The remaining £1,250 or so is taxable, and HMRC takes 20% of it, about £250. At £100,000 saved, you're looking at around £4,500 in interest, with roughly £3,500 of that taxable, and a bill near £700 a year purely on savings income. Manageable for now, perhaps, but the direction of travel matters, and it's about to get steeper. More on that shortly. Now back to that £22 gap, because it's the real story. The personal allowance has been frozen at £12,570 for years, and that freeze is confirmed to run on further still. Meanwhile, the state pension rises every April under the triple lock. This year it went up 4.8%, taking the full new state pension to £241.30 a week, around £12,547.60 a year. Put those two side by side, and the breathing room pensioners used to have has all but disappeared. Another rise like that next year and the state pension could overtake the personal allowance outright, meaning anyone on the full amount becomes a taxpayer from their pension alone, with no other income needed. This is how tax rises without a single announcement. Thresholds stay frozen, incomes edge up, and more of what you receive quietly slides into taxable territory. It rarely makes headlines, but it adds up. Let me tell you about someone I'll call Margaret. In her mid-70s, widowed a few years back, and after a lifetime of careful budgeting, she had around £75,000 sitting in a building society account. A letter arrived from HMRC saying she owed a few £100s in tax. She'd never had a tax bill before and reasonably assumed that no news meant her savings were safe. What nobody had told her is that every bank and building society reports the interest they pay you straight to HMRC, automatically every single year. Not when you declare it, not if you're asked. Her account had paid interest that pushed well past her £1,000 allowance, and HMRC knew before she did. How they collect depends on the size of the bill. Smaller amounts are usually recovered by quietly adjusting your tax code so your pension arrives a little lighter than expected, and you might not even notice. Larger amounts trigger a formal demand called a simple assessment, with a set deadline. If one of these ever lands and the figures look off, ask your bank for a year-end interest statement and compare it against what HMRC has on record. The two don't always match, and if they don't, you have grounds to query it. Worth knowing too, neither route requires you to have done anything wrong. HMRC simply gathers interest data from every bank each year, matches it to your tax code, and adjusts Niche, often months after the tax year in question has already closed. Now here's the part that genuinely frustrates me, because it's real money and almost nobody knows it exists. There's a third allowance separate again, called the starting rate for savings. If your income from everything other than savings, pension, earnings, rental income, comes to less than £17,570 a year, you can receive up to £5,000 of savings interest completely tax-free, not reduced, zero tax. That £17,570 figure is simply the £12,570 personal allowance with a £5,000 band sitting on top. There's a taper. For every pound your non-savings income goes above £12,570, the band shrinks by a pound, disappearing entirely once you hit £17,570. For a great many retirees whose income is mostly the state pension plus a modest top-up, a meaningful chunk of this band sits unused every year. Take someone I'll call Alan. He draws a full state pension plus a small workplace pension, bringing his total pension income to around £13,500. His savings pay him £3,800 in interest. For 2 years running, he paid tax on part of that because he'd been told his allowance was £1,000 and left it there. But look properly. His pension income sits about £950 above the personal allowance, so his starting rate band shrinks from £5,000 to roughly £4,050, comfortably covering his £3,800 of interest. His actual tax bill on savings? Nothing. His personal savings allowance was never even needed. He'd been handing HMRC money it was never owed, simply because nobody had laid the numbers out for him. For anyone drawing only the state pension with no other income at all, the position is even better. Stack the full £5,000 starting rate band on top of the £1,000 personal savings allowance, and you could hold somewhere around £130,000 in an ordinary savings account before a penny of tax falls due on the interest. At typical current rates, if you think you've overpaid, Form R40 is free on the government's website and lets you claim back recent years. That's your money. Go and get it. Now, changes are coming, and they matter. Confirmed in the budget and written into the Finance Act, from April 2027, the tax rate on savings interest above your allowances rises by 2 percentage points across the board. Basic rate from 20% to 22%, higher rate from 40% to 42%, and additional rate from 45% to 47%. This applies UK-wide since savings tax isn't devolved. On £3,000 of taxable interest, that's roughly an extra £60 a year for a basic rate taxpayer. Not huge alone, but permanent, and it lands alongside a second, quieter change. Currently, where your income comes from several sources, HMRC applies your personal allowance in whichever way leaves you paying the least tax. From April 2027, that flexibility disappears. The allowance gets set against earnings and pension income first, and only what's left, which for someone on a full state pension plus a workplace pension may be very little, can be used against savings interest. Here's the good news, aimed squarely at everyone watching. Interest earned inside a cash ISA sits completely outside all of this. None of the allowance limits touch it, none of the coming rate rises apply, and it isn't even reported to HMRC because there's nothing to report. There's one ISA change coming that cuts the other way for younger savers. From April 2027, the amount under 65s can put into a cash ISA drops to £12,000, with the rest of the £20,000 overall allowance steered towards stocks and shares. But, and this is written directly into policy, anyone 65 or over keeps the full £20,000 cash ISA allowance, no reduction at all. So, pulling it together, the personal allowance and the state pension have nearly merged into one figure, meaning more retirees than ever are becoming taxpayers on their pension alone. Your bank tells HMRC about your interest automatically, whether you expect it or not. The starting rate for savings sits unused for a great many people who'd qualify. From April 2027, savings tax rates rise and the allowance rules tighten, but cash ISAs, especially for the over 65s, remain a genuine shelter from nearly all of it. The single most useful thing you can do this week is check whether the starting rate band already covers your interest, and if you've got savings sitting outside an ISA, start moving what you can into one, using your own allowance and your partner's too, before another tax year slips by unused. One last thing, because it matters here more than almost anywhere else. None of this is advice tailored to your own situation. The right answer depends entirely on your own income and savings. For anything more involved, speak to a qualified accountant, a regulated financial advisor, or book a free session through PensionWise via Money Helper. Citizens Advice can help with the practical side too.